It was 2:48 in the morning on a Tuesday in September, and Officer Mark Reynolds was standing in a suburban backyard in Ohio, shining his heavy maglite beam down into a massive pit in the earth. Standing inside that pit, covered in mud and sweat from head to toe, was a man who was looking up at the officer with a wide, unblinking, and totally unnatural smile. Officer Reynolds had been called out to this address for a simple noise complaint. A neighbor had reported loud, rhythmic banging sounds, but as Reynolds looked at the man in the hole and then moved his flashlight beam just a few inches to the left to illuminate the strange, large metallic object the man was frantically trying to bury, the officer realized this was definitely not just a noise complaint. His hand instinctively drifted to his holster, and he reached for his shoulder radio to call for immediate backup, his voice shaking just slightly because he realized that the object in the hole was a heavy iron cage large enough to hold a human being. But what the police found in that hole was actually nothing compared to what they would find inside the man's house just 20 feet away. Inside that house was a discovery that would make seasoned detectives vomit and would reveal a plan so dark and so calculated it didn't seem possible for one human to conceive it. This story starts off as a simple neighborhood dispute about property lines and noise, but it spirals into madness very rapidly and leads to a discovery that shocked the entire state. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do. And we upload multiple times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to a lovely backyard barbecue. But when they ask for a hamburger, hand them a hot coal painted to look like a hamburger. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Cypher channel so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was late June 2018, and the oppressive summer heat had just settled over the quiet, leafy town of Westerville, Ohio. Mark and Sarah Thompson were a young, enthusiastic couple in their late 20s who had just achieved the absolute pinnacle of their dreams. They had purchased their first home. Mark worked in logistics for a large shipping company, and Sarah was a third-grade teacher, and they had spent the last 5 years living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, eating ramen noodles, and saving every single penny they could to make a down payment. The house they found was on a cul-de-sac called Pineview Court, and it was perfect. It was a 2-story colonial with white siding, black shutters, and a big, ancient oak tree in the front yard that cast long, cooling shadows over the driveway. The backyard was spacious and fenced in, which was crucial because Mark and Sarah had a 2-year-old golden retriever named Buster who needed plenty of room to run. The neighborhood was the kind of place you see in movies. It was the type of place where people actually waved to each other when they got their mail, where kids rode their bikes in the middle of the street until the streetlights buzzed on, and where on Friday nights you could smell charcoal grills firing up from 3 houses down. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. For Mark and Sarah, this wasn't just a house, it was their future. They imagined raising kids here. They imagined growing old here. On the day they moved in, the air smelled like cut grass and warm asphalt. Mark was sweating through his t-shirt, lugging boxes up the stairs while Sarah directed the movers with a clipboard in hand. Despite the exhaustion and the heat, they were buzzing with energy. That night, after the movers had left and the house was filled with that echoey sound of empty rooms filled with cardboard towers, they ordered pizza and sat on the floor of their living room drinking cheap wine out of plastic cups, just laughing. They felt safe. They felt like they had made it. The only slightly odd thing about the house, and honestly it was something they barely registered at the time, was the neighbor directly to their left. The Thompsons' house was bright and welcoming, but the house next door was different. It was the same style of architecture as theirs, but it looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1990s. The beige paint was peeling in long strips, revealing gray wood underneath. The blinds were always drawn tight, day and night, making the windows look like dead eyes. And the grass was always just a little too long, not long enough to get sighted by the city, but long enough to look unkempt and abandoned. The man who lived there was named Arthur Pendleton. On the second day after the Thompsons moved in, Mark was outside in the driveway trying to figure out how to work the garage door opener keypad when he felt eyes on him. He turned around, and there, standing right at the edge of the property line by the fence, was Arthur. He didn't wave, he didn't say hello, he just stood there. Arthur was a tall, gaunt man, probably in his mid-50s, with thinning gray hair that looked like it had been cut with kitchen scissors. He wore faded denim jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that hung loosely on his frame. Mark, being the friendly guy he was, immediately put on a smile, walked over to the fence, and extended a hand. He said, "Hey, I'm Mark. We just moved in next door." Arthur looked at Mark's hand for a solid 3 seconds before slowly reaching out to shake it. His grip was surprisingly strong, and his skin felt dry and rough like sandpaper. Arthur didn't smile. He just stared at Mark with pale, watery blue eyes and said in a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping together, "I'm Arthur. I keep to myself mostly." Mark chuckled nervously, trying to bridge the awkward gap, and said, "Well, that's nice. We're happy to be here. If you need anything, let us know." Arthur didn't respond to the offer. Instead, he leaned in slightly over the fence and asked, "What hours do you work, Mark?" It was a weird question for a first introduction. Blink surprised, but answered, "Usually 9 to 5. Why?" Arthur nodded slowly as if processing complex data, and then asked, "And your wife? Is she home during the day?" Mark felt a little prickle of unease on the back of his neck, but he told himself this guy was just socially awkward, maybe a little lonely. So Mark answered, "No, she's a teacher, so she's off for the summer right now." Arthur just stared at him for another long, uncomfortable moment, then muttered, "Good to know," and abruptly turned around and walked back into his house, shutting the door firmly behind him. Mark stood there in the driveway for a second, feeling a little weirded out, but he shrugged it off. He went inside and told Sarah about the quirky neighbor, and they both joked that every neighborhood has to have one weird guy, and at least he wasn't running a drum circle at midnight. For the next 3 weeks, life on Pineview Court was blissfully normal. Mark went to work, Sarah spent her days unpacking and decorating, and Buster chased squirrels in the backyard. They met the neighbors on the other side, a nice elderly couple named the Millers, who brought over a tray of lasagna. Everything was perfect. Until Tuesday, July 17th. It was the middle of a heat wave, and the air conditioning in the Thompsons' house was working overtime. Mark was a heavy sleeper. Usually, once his head hit the pillow, he was out cold until his alarm went off at 7 a.m. But on this particular night, something pulled him out of a deep sleep at exactly 3:14 a.m. He didn't know what it was at first. He lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above him. The room was cool and dark, and the only sound was the soft, rhythmic breathing of Sarah beside him. Mark closed his eyes, trying to drift back off, thinking maybe a car backfiring or a loud thunderclap had woken him up. But just as he was starting to drift, he heard it. Thump. It was a heavy, dull sound, like something heavy hitting the earth. Mark's eyes snapped open. He held his breath, listening. 5 seconds passed, 10 seconds, then scrape. It sounded like metal dragging against rock or hard dirt. It was coming from outside, from the backyard. Mark sat up slowly, trying not to wake Sarah. He swung his legs out of bed and crept across the carpet to the window that overlooked the back garden. The Thompsons' bedroom was on the 2nd floor, so they had a bird's-eye view of their yard and the neighboring yards. Mark carefully pulled the edge of the blackout curtain back just an inch so he wouldn't be seen, and he peered out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full that night, casting a pale, silvery light over the neighborhood. Mark scanned his own yard. Buster's toys were scattered on the grass, the grill was covered, everything looked normal. But then movement caught his eye to the left, in Arthur's backyard. Arthur's yard was surrounded by a high wooden privacy fence, but from the 2nd-story window, Mark could see right over it, and what he saw made no sense. Arthur was out there in the middle of the night. It was 3:15 a.m. now, and Arthur was wearing dark coveralls, the kind a mechanic would wear, and heavy boots. He had a floodlight set up on the ground, but he had put a piece of cardboard over the top of it, so the light was directed entirely downward into the ground, creating a concentrated pool of illumination that didn't spill over into the neighboring yards. Arthur was standing in the middle of his yard, holding a long-handled shovel, and he was digging. But he wasn't just casually gardening, he was digging with a manic, intense energy. He would slam the shovel into the ground, grunt with effort, and heave a pile of dirt over his shoulder. Thump, scrape, toss, thump, scrape, toss. Mark watched transfixed for about 10 minutes. The hole Arthur was working on was already significant. Mark estimated it was maybe 3 feet across, and he was already waist-deep in it. Why on earth would a man be digging a hole that size in the middle of the night, in total silence? Mark felt a chill go down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. There was something frantic about the way Arthur was moving. His movements were jerky and aggressive. Eventually, Mark stepped away from the window, feeling unsettled. He debated waking Sarah, but he knew she had trouble sleeping, and he didn't want to freak her out over something that, while weird, wasn't technically illegal. Maybe Arthur had a septic tank issue. Maybe he was an insomniac who loved gardening. Mark got back into bed, but he didn't sleep. He just lay there, listening to the faint, muffled rhythm coming from next door. Thump, scrape. Eventually, around 4:30 a.m., the sound stopped. Mark finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, the alarm went off at 7 a.m., and Mark shot out of bed. The events of the night before felt like a fever dream. He immediately went to the window and pulled back the curtains, expecting to see a massive pile of dirt and a hole in Arthur's yard. But when he looked down, Arthur's backyard was flat, completely normal. There was no hole, there was no pile of dirt. There was a patch of ground near the center of the yard that looked like it had been freshly raked and maybe some new sod had been put down, but otherwise it was as if the night before never happened. Mark stood there rubbing his eyes, wondering if he had dreamt the whole thing. He went downstairs and poured coffee, and when Sarah came down, he told her, "Hey, I think our neighbor was digging a hole last night." Sarah laughed, pouring almond milk into her cereal. "Digging a hole at 3 a.m., Mark? Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" Mark insisted he saw it, but when he took her to the window to show her, she just shrugged. "It looks normal out there, babe. Maybe he was just walking around and your sleepy brain filled in the rest." Mark wanted to believe her, he really did, so he dropped it. He went to work, came home, and life went on. But deep down, he knew what he saw, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur had been doing something he didn't want anyone to see. 2 nights later, it happened again. Mark woke up at 3 a.m. almost on the dot. This time, the sound was louder. Thump, scrape, clink. Mark rushed to the window, and sure enough, there was Arthur. Same coveralls, same muted floodlight, same manic energy, digging in a slightly different spot this time, a few feet closer to the fence that separated his yard from the Thompsons. Mark watched him for an hour. This time, Arthur was digging deep. Mark could see only the top of Arthur's head bobbing up and down as he threw dirt out of the pit. This wasn't gardening, this was excavation. Mark felt a surge of protectiveness mixed with fear. What was he burying? Or what was he looking for? The next morning, just like before, the yard was pristine. The hole was filled, the sod was replaced. Mark went out into his own backyard that Saturday morning pretending to check on his garden, but really he was trying to get a closer look at Arthur's yard through the cracks in the wooden fence. He couldn't see much, just grass, but then he heard the back door of Arthur's house open. Mark froze, pretending to weed his tomato plants. Footsteps crunched on the grass, approaching the fence. Mark stood up, wiping dirt from his hands, trying to look casual. Arthur was standing on the other side of the fence, staring at him. Arthur looked exhausted. He had dark purple circles under his eyes, and his skin looked paler than ever. He was holding a mug of black coffee. "Good morning, Arthur," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You doing some landscaping? I thought I heard some noise the last couple of nights." It was a direct probe. Mark wanted to see how Arthur would react. Arthur didn't blink. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Drainage," Arthur said, flatly. "My basement floods. The water table's high. I'm putting in drainage pipes." Mark looked at the flat yard. "At 3 in the morning?" Arthur's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "I have insomnia. I work when I'm awake." "Right," Mark said. "Well, it looks like hard work. You fill it back in every night?" Arthur stiffened. He leaned closer to the fence, and for the first time, Mark smelled him. Arthur smelled like wet earth and copper. "I do it in sections. Safety hazard to leave open holes, Mark. You have a dog. Wouldn't want your dog falling in." The way he said it didn't sound like concern for the dog. It sounded like a threat. Mark nodded slowly. "Right. Well, thanks for looking out for Buster." Arthur turned and walked away without another word, ending the conversation. Mark went back inside and told Sarah, "He says it's drainage, but Sarah, he looked angry that I asked." Sarah was starting to get a little concerned now, too. "Okay, well, if he's just fixing his drainage and he has insomnia, it's weird, but it's not a crime, Mark. Let's just keep an eye on it." But keeping an eye on it turned into an obsession for Mark. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern continued. Every other night, like clockwork, 3 a.m. digging, 5 a.m. filling it back in. But Mark noticed something disturbing as he watched from the window night after night. The holes were moving. They started in the middle of Arthur's yard, but every night the new hole was a few feet closer to the Thompsons' property line. It was like a slow-moving trench that was being dug and refilled, inching its way toward their fence, toward their house. Mark started keeping a log on his phone. July 20th, digging 10 feet from fence. July 22nd, digging 8 feet from fence. July 25th, digging 6 feet from fence. On July 28th, things escalated. Mark and Sarah were sitting in their living room watching a movie. It was about 9 p.m. Sarah got up to go to the kitchen to get some popcorn. Buster, the golden retriever, was in the backyard doing his business. Suddenly, Sarah screamed from the kitchen. Mark vaulted off the couch and ran in. "What is it? What's wrong?" Sarah was pale, pointing out the kitchen window toward the backyard. "There was a face, Mark. There was a face in the window." Mark grabbed a heavy flashlight from the utility drawer and unlocked the back door. "Stay here," he commanded. He ran out onto the back patio, sweeping the beam of light across the yard. Buster was barking furiously at the fence line, the fence shared with Arthur. Mark ran to the fence and shone the light over it. There was nothing there, just Arthur's dark, silent yard. Mark scanned the perimeter, looking for footprints in the flower beds beneath the kitchen window. Sure enough, in the soft mulch right under the window where Sarah had been standing, there was a fresh boot print, deep and heavy. Mark didn't hesitate. He marched around to the front of the house and stomped up to Arthur's front porch. He pounded on the door. Bang, bang, bang! "Arthur, open up! I know you're in there!" Silence. The house was dark. Mark pounded again. "Arthur, if you come onto my property again, I'm calling the police." The door didn't open, but the curtain in the window right next to the door moved. Mark saw a sliver of a pale face, Arthur's face, watching him. Then the curtain dropped back into place. Mark went back home, furious and terrified. He called the police non-emergency line. An officer came out about an hour later, took a report, looked at the footprint, and basically shrugged. "We can't prove it was him," the officer said. "It's a boot print. It could be anyone. Keep your doors locked and get some cameras." So that's exactly what Mark did. The next day, he spent $500 on a high-end security system, cameras on the front door, cameras on the back door, and 2 cameras pointed specifically at the fence line bordering Arthur's yard. Mark felt a sense of grim satisfaction. Let him try to dig now, Mark thought. I'll have him in 4K resolution. But that night, something strange happened. Mark set up the system, tested it on his phone, and went to bed feeling secure for the first time in weeks. But at 3 a.m., he woke up again, not to the sound of digging, but to a notification on his phone. Camera offline. Mark frowned and tapped the app. Backyard camera 1, offline. Backyard camera 2, offline. He reset the app. Nothing. He got out of bed and looked out the window, down into the yard. The cameras he had just installed that afternoon were dark. The little red infrared lights that should have been glowing were out. Mark grabbed his flashlight and went downstairs. He went out the back door and walked over to where he had mounted the cameras on the eaves of the house. The wires had been cut. Someone had come into his yard in the complete silence of the night, avoided the motion sensors or moved so slowly they didn't trigger, and had snipped the power cables to the cameras with surgical precision. Mark felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a weird neighbor fixing drainage. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and they were escalating. Mark didn't go to work the next day. He stayed home watching the house. He called the police again, but without video evidence of Arthur cutting the wires, they said it was just vandalism. "Could be kids," the dispatcher suggested. Mark slammed the phone down in frustration. That evening, Mark and Sarah had a serious talk. "We need to leave," Sarah said. She was crying. "I don't feel safe here, Mark. He was looking in the window. He cut the cameras. What does he want?" "We can't just leave, Sarah. We just bought this house. We have a 30-year mortgage. We can't afford to move." Mark was trying to be rational, but he was just as scared as she was. "I'll fix the cameras. I'll put them higher up. I'll get a gun if I have to. He's just trying to scare us." But Arthur wasn't just trying to scare them. He was preparing for something. August rolled around, and the atmosphere on Pineview Court was thick with tension. Mark spent his nights keeping vigil by the window, drinking energy drinks, watching Arthur. But weirdly, once the cameras were cut, Arthur stopped digging. For a week, there was silence. No thump, no scrape. Mark started to think maybe the confrontation had worked. Maybe Arthur knew Mark was watching and had backed off. But then, on August 14th, the noise returned. But it was different this time. It wasn't just digging. It was metallic, heavy, mechanical sounds, clanking and grinding. Mark looked out the window at 3 a.m. and saw Arthur in the yard again. But this time, he wasn't alone in the hole. Or rather, he wasn't just using a shovel. He was lowering something into the ground. Mark squinted, trying to make it out in the moonlight. It looked like large, thick PVC pipes, massive ones, like sewer mains. Arthur was connecting them together in the trench he had dug. "Drainage," Mark whispered to himself. "Maybe he really is just putting in drainage, right?" But the size of the pipes was excessive. They were huge, wide enough for a person to crawl through. Mark watched as Arthur buried the pipes and smoothed the earth over again. The next day, Mark went to the city hall. He pulled the permits for his street. He wanted to see if Arthur had filed for any renovation work, drainage, sewage, anything. The clerk at the desk looked up the address. 24 Pineview Court, Arthur Pendleton. "Let me see." She typed on her keyboard for a moment, then shook her head. No permits pulled for that address in 15 years. Nothing. "So any digging he's doing is illegal?" Mark asked. "Technically, yes," the clerk said, "especially if he's messing with utility lines." This was it. This was the smoking gun Mark needed. He didn't need to prove Arthur was a creep. He just needed to prove he was doing unpermitted construction. That would get the city inspectors out there, and they would force him to dig it up and stop. Mark felt a surge of triumph. He drove home ready to make the call the next morning and get the city involved. But Mark would never get the chance to make that call. That night, Tuesday, August 15th, was the night everything came to a head. That night, Mark didn't even bother trying to sleep. He sat in the oversized armchair in the corner of the master bedroom, the one positioned perfectly so that if he leaned just an inch to the right, he could see through the gap in the curtains down into the yard. His phone was in his lap, the screen dimmed low, ready to dial 911 at a moment's notice. Sarah was asleep in the bed, but her sleep was restless. She kept tossing and turning, mumbling in her dreams. The stress of the last few weeks had seeped into her subconscious, turning their sanctuary into a place of subtle, hovering dread. The clock on the nightstand ticked over to 2 a.m., silence outside, just the hum of the neighborhood transformers and the occasional distant car on the main road. 2:30 a.m., still nothing. Mark's eyelids were growing heavy. He had worked a full shift that day, and the adrenaline that had been keeping him going was starting to fade into a dull exhaustion. He started to think that maybe tonight would be a quiet night. Maybe Arthur had taken a break. Maybe he knew Mark was onto him regarding the permits. But then, at exactly 2:48 a.m., the sound began. It wasn't the usual rhythmic thump of a shovel hitting dirt. This time, the sound was different. It was closer, sharper. It sounded like metal grinding against concrete. Skirt. Clank. Mark jolted upright in the chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound wasn't coming from the center of Arthur's yard where the previous holes had been. It was coming from right below the window, right at the fence line. Mark leaned forward and peered through the crack in the curtains. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Arthur was there, but he wasn't alone in the middle of the yard anymore. He was jammed right up against the wooden privacy fence that separated his property from the Thompsons. He was on his knees in the dirt, and he wasn't using the long-handled shovel. He was using a small hand trowel, and, strangest of all, he was working with a heavy black tarp draped over himself and the area he was working on, like a photographer from the 1800s under a hood. It looked like he was trying to shield the light completely or hide exactly what he was manipulating right at the base of the fence. The grinding noise came again, louder this time. Clank, scrape! Mark realized with a jolt of horror that the sound wasn't Arthur hitting a rock in the soil. It sounded like Arthur was interacting with the foundation of the fence, or worse, the foundation of Mark's house. The property lines were tight here. The houses were only about 15 feet apart. Arthur was mere feet away from where Mark was sitting. Mark didn't hesitate. This wasn't just suspicious behavior anymore. This was property damage, and it felt threatening. He unlocked his phone and dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Yeah, this is Mark Thompson at 22 Pineview Court. I need police here immediately. My neighbor he's in his backyard, right up against my house. He's digging, and I think he's trying to damage my foundation or break in. He's been doing this for weeks, but tonight he's right at the wall. Is he on your property, sir? He's right on the line. He's inches away. I can hear him grinding metal, Mark whispered, trying not to wake Sarah, though he knew he probably should. Okay, sir, we have a unit in the area. I'm sending them over for a noise complaint and suspicious activity. Do not engage the neighbor, stay inside, and lock your doors. I'm not going out there. Just please, hurry. Mark hung up and watched. The wait was agonizing. Every minute felt like an hour. Beneath the tarp, Arthur was moving frantically now. The tarp would jerk and spasm as Arthur worked beneath it, like some giant black beetle burrowing into the earth. 10 minutes later, though it felt like 10 years, a cruiser rolled silently onto the cul-de-sac. The officer killed the headlights before turning onto the street, utilizing the stealth approach that police often use when responding to a burglary in progress or a domestic dispute where they don't want to escalate the situation immediately. Mark watched as two uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicle. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man, Officer Mark Reynolds, and the other was a younger female officer named Jenkins. They unholstered their flashlights but kept them off initially, moving like shadows up the driveway of Arthur's house. Mark wanted to open the window and shout, "He's in the back!" But he stayed silent, trusting them to do their job. He watched as they rounded the corner of the garage and disappeared into the side yard that led to the back. A few seconds later, the backyard erupted in light. Beams from the heavy mag lights cut through the darkness, landing squarely on the black tarp huddled against the fence. "Police department, show me your hands!" Officer Reynolds' voice boomed, shattering the silence of the night. The tarp stopped moving for a second. There was absolute stillness. Even the crickets seemed to stop chirping. Mark held his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the windowsill. Slowly, very slowly, the tarp began to rise. Arthur stood up, letting the black plastic slide off his back and pool around his feet. He was wearing those same filthy coveralls, but now they were caked in fresh, wet clay. His face was smeared with dirt, and his hands were gloved. He squinted into the blinding light of the flashlights. "Hands! Get your hands up now!" Reynolds yelled. Arthur slowly raised his hands, showing his palms. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a heavy-duty wrench. He dropped it with a dull thud onto the grass. "Step away from the fence. Turn around and face me," Reynolds commanded. Arthur complied, moving with a strange, jerky calmness. He turned and faced the officers, offering that wide, unsettling smile that Mark had seen the day he moved in. "Good evening, officers," Arthur rasped. "Is there a problem?" "We had a report of a disturbance," Reynolds said, moving closer, keeping his hand near his holster. "What are you doing out here at 3 a.m. with a tarp over your head?" "Drainage," Arthur said, the word coming out like a rehearsed line. "Emergency drainage repair, leak in the main line." Officer Reynolds wasn't buying it. He signaled for Officer Jenkins to cover him while he moved closer to inspect the area where Arthur had been working. He shined his light down at the base of the fence. Mark, watching from the window, saw Officer Reynolds freeze. The beam of light stopped moving. It stayed fixed on a spot on the ground right where the fence met the earth. Reynolds leaned in closer, squinting. Then he took a step back, his body language shifting from routine check to high alert. "Jenkins, cuff him now," Reynolds barked, his voice tight. Arthur didn't resist. He let Officer Jenkins spin him around and click the handcuffs onto his wrists, but he kept smiling, staring directly at the house, directly at Mark's window, almost as if he knew Mark was watching. Once Arthur was secured in the back of the cruiser, Officer Reynolds returned to the spot by the fence and knelt down. Mark couldn't stand it anymore. He woke Sarah, telling her, "Police are here. They got him. Stay here." And he ran downstairs in his boxer shorts and t-shirt. He unlocked the back door and ran out to the fence. "Officer," Mark yelled. "Officer, I'm the neighbor who called. Is everything okay?" Officer Reynolds looked up, shining the light momentarily in Mark's face before lowering it. "Sir, stay on your side of the fence, please. But you need to see this." Mark walked to the fence, peering over. Officer Reynolds pointed his flashlight into the hole Arthur had been digging. It wasn't a drainage ditch. It was a heavy, rusted iron cage about 4 feet long and 3 feet wide, buried almost completely vertically into the earth, like a spider hole. The top of the cage had a hinged lid with a heavy padlock hasp welded onto it. Arthur had been in the process of welding the cage to a steel rebar stake driven deep into the ground, anchoring it so it couldn't be moved. "What is that?" Mark whispered, his stomach churning. "Looks like a holding cell," Reynolds said grimly. "Animal control, maybe? But this is too heavy for a dog, sir. Did your neighbor have any pets?" "No," Mark said. "He lived alone. No dogs, no cats." Reynolds stood up, brushing dirt off his knees. "Okay, we're gonna need to search the property. This goes beyond a noise complaint. Now we have probable cause with this contraption here and the noise disturbance. We need to make sure there isn't anyone or anything inside that house." Mark nodded, feeling a wave of nausea. He was digging toward my house, officer. Look at the angle." Reynolds looked at the cage and then at the fresh trench leading away from it. Sure enough, the disturbance in the earth wasn't parallel to the fence. It was angled directly toward the foundation of Mark's kitchen. "We're going in," Reynolds said into his radio. "Dispatch, I have a suspect in custody regarding suspicious activity and potential kidnapping implements found on site, proceeding with a wellness check on the residence, requesting backup and a sergeant." The next hour was a blur of flashing blue lights. 2 more cruisers arrived. Sarah had come downstairs wrapped in a blanket, shivering despite the heat, standing on the back patio with Mark as they watched the police stack up at Arthur's back door. Officer Reynolds knocked heavily. "Police department, search warrant coming in." Technically, it was exigent circumstances at this point, pending a warrant, but they weren't taking chances. No answer. Reynolds kicked the door right next to the deadbolt. The wood splintered with a loud crack, and the door swung open, revealing a pitch-black kitchen. Officers flooded in, flashlights cutting through the gloom. Mark and Sarah strained to listen, expecting shouting or gunshots, but there was only silence. Eerie, heavy silence. They saw the flashlight beams dancing in the windows, moving from room to room. About 10 minutes later, Officer Reynolds came back out the back door. He walked over to the fence where Mark was waiting. Reynolds looked pale. His usually stoic face was drawn and tight. "Mr. Thompson," Reynolds said, his voice low, "I need you to answer me honestly. Have you or your wife ever been inside Mr. Pendleton's house?" "Never," Mark said. "We spoke once over the fence. That's it. Why?" Reynolds took a deep breath. "Okay, we're securing the scene. Detectives are on their way. You guys need to go back inside, lock your doors, and do not come out until we tell you. We found some things concerning you." "Concerning us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What do you mean?" "Just go inside," Reynolds said firmly. "Please." Mark and Sarah retreated into their kitchen, locking the door. They sat at the kitchen table holding hands, watching the lights of the police cars reflect off the ceiling. Neither of them spoke. The dread was a physical weight in the room. Meanwhile, inside 24 Pineview Court, the police were uncovering a nightmare. The ground floor of Arthur's house was deceptive. It was messy, yes, but in a mundane way. There were stacks of old newspapers from the 90s, piles of junk mail, and dirty dishes in the sink that had mold growing on them. It smelled like stale air and rotting food, typical recluse squalor, but nothing criminal. But when Officer Jenkins had opened the door to the basement, everything changed. The door to the basement wasn't a normal hollow-core interior door. It was a heavy steel exterior security door installed inside the house. It had 3 deadbolts. Jenkins had to use the keys found in Arthur's pocket to open it. When the door swung open, a blast of cold air hit them. Arthur had the air conditioning cranked down to near freezing in the basement, and there was a smell, not of rot, but of chemicals, bleach and ozone. The officers descended the wooden stairs, their boots clunking loudly at the bottom. They found themselves in a space that didn't look like a basement at all. It looked like a bunker. The walls were covered entirely in acoustic foam, the black egg crate kind used in recording studios. Soundproofing, total soundproofing. You could scream down there until your throat bled, and no one on the street would hear a whisper. But the centerpiece of the room was the far wall. Positioned against the wall was a long folding table, and on that table sat a bank of 6 high-definition computer monitors. They were all glowing blue, casting a ghostly light over the room. Officer Reynolds had walked over to the monitors, and that was when he felt the bile rise in his throat. The monitors weren't showing the internet or TV. They were showing live feeds from security cameras. Monitor 1, a view of the Pineview Court cul-de-sac, focused on Mark and Sarah's driveway. Monitor 2, a high-angle view of the Thompsons' backyard. Monitor 3, a view inside a living room showing a beige couch and a TV. Mark and Sarah's living room. Monitor 4, a view of a kitchen showing the island and the fridge. Mark and Sarah's kitchen. Monitor 5, a view of a bedroom showing a king-sized bed with a blue duvet. Mark and Sarah's bedroom. Monitor 6, a black screen with text reading, "Signal lost." This was likely the camera Mark had seen the wires cut on. "Jesus Christ," Jenkins whispered. How does he have cameras inside their house?" Reynolds looked closely at the monitors. The resolution was crystal clear. These weren't grainy hidden cams. These were high-end fiber optic lenses. Reynolds followed the cables running from the back of the computer tower. They ran up the wall, across the ceiling, and disappeared into a large bundle of PVC piping that went directly into the north wall, the wall facing the Thompsons' house. Reynolds walked over to that wall and saw the map taped there. It was a large architectural blueprint of the 2 properties. Someone, Arthur, had drawn complex diagrams in red marker over the blueprints. The diagrams showed a tunnel originating from Arthur's basement, going under the fence line and terminating underneath the crawlspace of the Thompsons' house. The notes scribbled in the margins were chillingly precise. Access point A, HVAC intake. Access point B, master bedroom floor vent. Insertion date, August 20th. Arthur hadn't just been watching them, he had been preparing to enter. Reynolds looked around the rest of the room. In the corner, there was a mattress on the floor with leather restraint straps bolted to the concrete floor. Next to it was a surgical tray on wheels, neatly arranged with tools, scalpels, bone saws, pliers, and a terrifyingly large syringe. This wasn't just a stalker. Arthur Pendleton was a predator who had built a spider's web, and he was days, maybe hours away from pulling the fly in. "Sergeant is going to want to see this," Reynolds muttered. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, we have a confirmed Class A felony situation here. We have surveillance equipment, illicit tunneling, and torture implements. We need the crime scene unit now." Back in the kitchen, Mark and Sarah jumped as a heavy knock sounded on their front door. It was a detective in a suit, holding a badge. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he said, his face grave, "I need you to come with me. We need to get you out of this house tonight. We need to process a crime scene. And, frankly, you shouldn't be here." "What did you find?" Mark asked, his voice cracking. The detective hesitated, then sighed. "We found cameras, Mark, inside your house. He's been watching you." Sarah let out a sob and covered her mouth. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. "Inside? How?" "We're still figuring that out, but you need to pack a bag. Go to a hotel or family. Do not stay here." As they were escorted out to their car, walking past the police tape and the flashing lights, Mark looked over at Arthur's house. The front door was open, and police were carrying out boxes of evidence. Mark looked at the basement window, a small rectangle of glass near the ground, and shuddered, realizing that just feet below that grass, a monster had been sitting in the dark, watching them sleep, planning their end. But the story doesn't end with the arrest, because when investigators started tearing apart Arthur's basement walls to trace the wires, they found something else. Something that turned this from a creepy neighbor story into a statewide manhunt for answers. Behind the acoustic foam on the south wall, hidden behind a false panel, they found a collection of trophies. There were driver's licenses, jewelry, and locks of hair, dozens of them, dating back 30 years. Arthur Pendleton hadn't just started with Mark and Sarah. Mark and Sarah were just the latest project. The police ran the names on the licenses. The first one belonged to a woman named Jessica Millet. She had gone missing from Columbus, Ohio in 1998. She was never found. The second license belonged to a college student named David Ross, missing since 2005. The realization hit the department like a freight train. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just a weirdo digging holes. He was a serial killer who had been operating under the radar for 3 decades, using his skills in excavation and construction to literally bury his secrets. And the digging in the backyard, the holes that Mark had seen appear and disappear, they weren't for drainage, and they weren't just for the cage. Looking at the map again, the detectives realized the circles drawn in the backyard corresponded to storage sites. The police brought in ground-penetrating radar the next morning as the sun rose over the quiet neighborhood of Pineview Court. The backyard that Mark had looked at every day, thinking it was just ugly grass, was revealed to be a graveyard. The radar pinged 4 distinct anomalies deep underground, beneath the layers of soil Arthur had meticulously turned over and replaced. Mark and Sarah, watching the news from a hotel room across town, saw the aerial footage from the news helicopter. It showed their house, and next to it, Arthur's yard, swarming with men in white hazmat suits, setting up forensic tents over the spots where Arthur had been digging. "He was moving them," Mark whispered, staring at the TV. "The holes. He was digging them up and moving them closer to the tunnel. Why?" The answer would come out during the interrogation, and it was perhaps the most disturbing detail of all. Arthur Pendleton sat in the interrogation room at the Westerville Police Precinct looking utterly bored. He was handcuffed to the metal table, wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung off his skeletal frame like a tent. The stark white fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, reflecting off his bald spot, casting long shadows over his face that made his eyes look like 2 dark pits. Detective Miller, the lead investigator on the case, sat across from him with a thick file folder on the table between them. Miller had been a cop for 25 years. He had seen domestic homicides, gang violence, and horrific accidents, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the contents of Arthur's backyard, or the contents of Arthur's mind. Miller opened the file and slid a photo across the table. It was a picture of the iron cage found in the hole. "Tell me about this, Arthur," Miller said, his voice level, trying not to betray the disgust he felt. What was the plan for this? Arthur looked at the photo and shrugged. It's a containment unit, he said, his voice raspy and dry. For the new arrivals. The new arrivals, Miller repeated. You mean Mark and Sarah Thompson? Arthur smiled that same thin, wide smile. They were perfect, he whispered. Young, healthy, good genetics. They would have lasted a long time. Miller felt a chill run down his spine. Lasted a long time doing what, Arthur? Arthur didn't answer that. Instead, he leaned forward, the chains of his handcuffs rattling against the table. Did you find the others? He asked. Did you find my friends in the yard? We found 4 bodies, Arthur, Miller said. We're still identifying them, but we know about Jessica Millay and David Ross. Why were you moving them, Arthur? We saw the fresh digging. You were digging them up and moving them closer to the fence. Why? Arthur looked at Miller, as if the answer was obvious, as if he were explaining simple addition to a child. I was building an extension, Arthur said. The tunnel. It wasn't just a hallway, Detective. It was a home. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn, into pure psychological horror. Arthur explained with zero emotion that he viewed his victims not as people he had killed, but as his eternal family. For decades, he had kept them buried in specific spots in his yard, arranged in a pattern that only he understood. He would visit them at night, sitting by their graves, talking to them, telling them about his day. But when Mark and Sarah moved in next door, Arthur developed a new obsession. He didn't just want to capture them, he wanted to integrate them into his family. The tunnel he was digging from his basement to their house wasn't just an abduction route, it was a construction project. Arthur was moving the skeletal remains of his previous victims into niches along the sides of the tunnel. He was creating a catacomb, a subterranean gallery of death that would link his house to Mark and Sarah's house. His plan, his masterpiece, was to break through the floor of the Thompsons' bedroom, subdue them, drag them down into the tunnel, and keep them in the cages he was installing right alongside the remains of the others. He wanted Mark and Sarah to live in the walls of the tunnel, to be the parents of his underground family. He wanted to be able to walk from his basement through a hallway lined with his friends and end up in the cage room where he could watch Mark and Sarah. They were going to be the centerpieces, Arthur said, his eyes glazing over with a distant fantasy. It would have been beautiful. Everything connected, everything together, underground, where no one could bother us. Detective Miller slammed the file shut. He had heard enough. He stood up and walked out of the room, leaving Arthur alone with his twisted dreams. The fallout from the confession was immediate and explosive. The news trucks arrived in swarms, parking all along Pineview Court. Satellite dishes pointed at the sky, broadcasting the horror to the entire nation. Mark and Sarah saw their house, their dream home, on every channel, described as the House of Horrors. Forensic anthropologists spent 2 weeks at the site. They excavated the entire backyard, turning the lush green lawn into a cratered wasteland of mud and yellow police tape. They found a total of 5 bodies, the 4 that Arthur had mentioned, plus 1 more, a hitchhiker who had never been reported missing, buried deep under the foundation of Arthur's garage. As for the surveillance equipment inside the Thompsons' house, the investigation revealed exactly how Arthur had done it. It turned out that 6 months before Mark and Sarah bought the house, the property had been sitting empty. It was owned by a bank after a foreclosure. During that window of time, Arthur had broken in through a basement window. He had spent weeks inside the empty house, drilling tiny micro holes into the drywall and threading high-tech fiber optic cables through the HVAC ducts. He had covered the tiny camera lenses with spackle and painted over them, leaving just a pinprick hole that was invisible to the naked eye unless you were inches away. He had painted the walls. He had patched the holes. He had essentially prepped the house for his future victims, waiting for the right couple to move in. Mark and Sarah had been living in a trap from the moment they turned the key in the lock. The trial of Arthur Pendleton was short. There was no denying the physical evidence, the bodies, the cameras, the confession. It was open and shut. Arthur didn't even try to defend himself. He sat in the courtroom sketching on a notepad, drawing diagrams of tunnels and cages, completely detached from the reality of his situation. He was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted kidnapping, and dozens of other charges. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 200 years just to make sure he would never breathe fresh air again. He is currently incarcerated at a maximum security supermax facility in Ohio, where he is kept in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. But for Mark and Sarah, the nightmare didn't end with the verdict. They tried to go back to work. They tried to move on, but the psychological scars were too deep. Every time Mark heard a floorboard creak, he froze. Every time Sarah saw a shadow move in the corner of her eye, she panicked. They couldn't sleep without lights on. They couldn't be in a room with the door closed. They never stepped foot inside 24 Pineview Court again. They hired a moving company to go in and get their furniture, but instructed them to burn the mattress and the bedding, anything that had been in the bedroom where Arthur had been watching them. The house itself became a pariah. Nobody wanted to buy the tunnel house. Nobody wanted to live next door to the property where 5 bodies had been dug up. The neighborhood property values plummeted. The neighbors who had once waved and smiled were now traumatized themselves, looking at their own yards, wondering what might be buried there. Eventually, the bank that held the mortgage on the Thompsons' house and Arthur's house made a decision. It was the only decision that made sense. In October of 2019, a demolition crew arrived on Pineview Court. Heavy excavators rolled down the street, the same street where kids used to ride bikes. Huge metal claws tore into the roof of Arthur's house, ripping down the walls, the peeling beige paint, the basement where he had sat and watched his monitors. It was all reduced to a pile of splintered wood and drywall. Then the machines turned to Mark and Sarah's house. The beautiful white colonial with the black shutters was torn down right alongside it. The tunnel that connected them was collapsed and filled with concrete, sealing the darkness underground forever. The land was cleared, leveled, and seeded with grass. Today, if you go to Pineview Court, there is just an empty green field between 2 houses, a gap in the smile of the neighborhood, like a missing tooth. The locals call it the quiet lot. Nobody walks their dogs there. Kids don't play ball there. It sits empty. A silent memorial to a horror that grew right beneath the surface of a perfect suburban life. Mark and Sarah moved to a different state, far away from Ohio. They bought a condo on the top floor of a high-rise building. Mark said in an interview years later that he specifically chose it because it had concrete floors and no backyard. "I don't want to own dirt anymore," he said. "I just want to be high up where no one can dig under me." This story is a terrifying reminder that we often assume our homes are our castles, our sanctuaries where the world can't hurt us. We lock our doors, we close our blinds, and we feel safe, but we rarely think about what or who might be right on the other side of the wall or just a few feet beneath the floorboards. We assume our neighbors are just people living their lives parallel to ours. Maybe they are a little weird, maybe they are a little loud, but we never imagine that when they look at us, they aren't seeing a neighbor, they are seeing a project. Arthur Pendleton wasn't a monster who lived under a bridge or in a dark forest. He was the guy next door. He was the guy who watched you mow your lawn. He was the guy who picked up his mail. He was the guy who was always there, just on the other side of the fence, waiting, digging, planning. So the next time you wake up at 3 a.m. to a strange sound in the backyard, maybe a thump or a scrape, don't just roll over and go back to sleep. Get up, look out the window, because you never know who might be out there in the dark, digging a hole just for you. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Cypher podcast. If you enjoyed this story, or if it terrified you into checking your basement for tunnels, please consider subscribing to the channel. We upload new stories about the strange, dark, and mysterious multiple times a week. And if you want to support the channel, please invite the like button over for a friendly game of hide and seek. But when it's the like button's turn to hide, just get in your car and drive to a different state and start a new life without telling them. Until next time, stay safe, keep your doors locked, and maybe, just maybe, check the foundation of your house. See ya.